Sundown Ridge wasn't marked on most maps. A jagged line of red earth canyons and scrub valleys tucked into the southern curve of Utah, it looked like a forgotten scar from above. Winding gullies, rock spires, and sun-bleached driftwood scattered across the hills like old bones. It was the kind of place where the wind could erase your footsteps within hours, and where cell signals didn't dare wander. Ranger Marlin Kessler had walked these trails for 10 years. She'd come west from a world of clamor, sirens, deadlines, the buzz of a life lived too loud, and stayed for the silence that followed. Out here, everything moved at the pace of heat. Lizards blinked slowly. Coyotes barked once and fell still. Even grief, when it came, took its time. That morning, she had set out early with her only companion, a half-retired German shepherd named Rowan, whose graying muzzle and scarred flank told more stories than most men ever could. Rowan walked ahead of her, ears turning with every desert noise, tail flicking low. They weren't on duty, just checking the old flood basin near Ash Hollow, a dry bend that sometimes drew in lost wildlife when the rains hit strange. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern rim. The canyon walls still wore the cool lavender shade of pre-dawn, and Marlin was thinking of nothing in particular, just the feel of the wind, the crunch beneath her boots, when Rowan stopped cold. His ears shot forward, his body stiffened. Marlin paused. "What is it?" Rowan didn't answer, of course. He took one sharp sniff of the air and bolted down the embankment. "Rowan!" She gave chase without thinking, sliding on loose shale. Her boots caught rock edges. Thorn branches snapped at her arms. Down and down the dog went, faster than he had in months. Whatever he'd heard or smelled, it had cut past his age and stiff hips. Marlin caught up near the base of the ravine. The air changed here. Cooler, thicker, almost damp. The scent of disturbed earth. And something else. Blood? Rowan stood at the edge of a fallen cottonwood, hackles raised. His body trembled with alert tension, but he didn't bark. He simply stared ahead, frozen. Marlin followed his eyes. At first she couldn't see. The morning light hadn't fully poured into the canyon's base, and everything was cast in bronze-grey shadow. Then, movement. A flicker near the roots, a flash of fur, and a sound so soft it barely carried. A whimper. She stepped forward slowly, heart suddenly high in her chest. It was the sound of something small, hurt, alone. As her eyes adjusted, the shapes became clearer. 2 bobcat cubs, barely out of kittenhood, cowered beneath the fallen tree. One was hissing, a faint, rasping warning, as if summoning courage it didn't fully own. The other pressed into its sibling's flank, visibly injured, a smear of red along its shoulder. Their ears were flat, their tails twitched wildly. Marlin froze. Bobcats this young out here, without a mother? No. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. She glanced at Rowan, whose stance hadn't shifted. His body remained tense, but now his nose tilted toward something farther down the gulch. Another sound, low, dry. A hiss. It wasn't feline. Marlin took a single step to the side, just enough to change her line of sight past the cubs. And there it was. A python. Massive. Its body lay half buried beneath fallen brush and curled sediment, but its coils were unmistakable, thick, golden brown with blotched markings. Muscles like cables, a head that could wrap around a raccoon's torso. Its tongue flicked once in the air, and its eyes were locked on the cubs. Marlin's pulse surged into her throat. She felt the world narrow, her breath shallow, her skin go cold despite the rising heat. This wasn't just a snake. This was a Burmese python, an invasive apex predator known for its grip, its speed, its unrelenting instinct to crush and swallow anything it could overpower. And it didn't belong here. Not in Utah. Not anywhere near these ridges. Marlin's brain stuttered for an explanation. Zoo escape? Illegal release? Someone dumping exotics to fend for themselves? It didn't matter. The cubs were seconds away from being wrapped. The python moved. Its muscles shifted under its skin, slow but deliberate, like an oil slick coming to life. Its eyes had the dull amber haze of hunger, not malice. It had likely been stalking them for hours, maybe longer, waiting for the perfect strike. And now it had them cornered. Marlin reached for her side holster, unclipping the tranquilizer rifle she carried during out-of-contact patrols. But the distance was bad. The slope, the tree, the brush. Too many ways to miss. Roan didn't wait. He lunged forward without a sound, paws slamming into rock and dirt, and with a guttural, primal growl, he struck, charging straight at the python with the kind of fearless fury only a seasoned dog could muster. Marlin gasped, heart lurching. Roan hit the coils with his teeth bared, claws digging for purchase. The python recoiled in surprise, body snapping back. But it moved fast. Too fast. Its tail whipped around, catching Roan across the ribs and sending him tumbling sideways. The cubs shrieked. Dust flew. The python coiled again, and this time it was ready. Marlin took aim. But before she could fire, a blur of movement cut through her field of vision. The older bobcat cub, the bolder one, launched forward. It leapt toward the python. Not away. Not to flee. But to fight. The young bobcat's leap was wild, more instinct than strategy. Its small body twisted mid-air, paws extended, claws flashing silver in the half-light. For one heartbeat, it soared. Then it landed squarely on the python's upper coil, just behind its head. The snake responded instantly. It reared, muscles rippling as its thick body convulsed in a sudden arc. Dust exploded from the earth. The cub held fast, jaws snapping forward and sinking into the python's neck, right above the jaw hinge. A scream rose from the snake. Not a voice, but a terrible, vibrating rasp that shivered through Marlin's bones. Roan, dazed but recovering, pushed himself to his feet, growling low. His shoulder bled, but he was still in the fight. The python whipped its tail again, aiming to dislodge the bobcat. But the cub wouldn't let go. Its claws dug deep. Its fangs remained locked in. Marlin knew what this was now. Not survival. This was vengeance. This cub had likely seen something she hadn't. Perhaps this snake had already taken their mother. Perhaps the cub remembered, and now it was fighting not to escape, but to end it. Still, he was so small. The python coiled tighter, lifting its massive body off the ground. The bobcat was thrown, landing hard against the dry mud bank. It skidded, yowling, but didn't cry out. Roan leapt in again. He attacked from the side, jaws clamping down on the python's midsection. This time, he bit hard enough that blood welled, thick and dark, and the snake screeched, spinning violently in the dust. Its tail smashed into Rowan's back, sending him tumbling. "Rowan!" Marlin shouted, stepping forward with the tranq rifle. She had no clear shot. Too much movement. The cub was back on its feet. Limber, fast. It lunged again, not for the neck this time, but for the eyes. It struck like lightning. The bobcat's front claws slashed across the python's face, catching its right eye. The serpent reared back with a hideous lurch, body arching, its momentum lifting part of it clean off the ground. Dust and gravel spun into the air. The python was blind on one side now. It turned, panicked, but the fight was unraveling. Rowan came in from behind, teeth finding flesh again. The bobcat dove once more, this time aiming for the wounded eye. The snake writhed, twisting violently, knocking against rock and bark. The sheer chaos of it churned the ravine into a storm of sound and motion. Then it broke. The python uncoiled, half collapsing under its own pain. Its body undulated wildly, smacking into trees, cutting a bloody trail through the dust. Then with a final heave, it slithered off, crashing through the brush. It didn't die, but it was defeated. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was tense, rattling, fragile. Marlin's knees gave slightly. She lowered the tranq rifle, chest heaving. The smell of blood, bobcat, dog, and snake hung thick in the air. Rowan limped back toward her, fur coated in grit, panting. His flanks were scratched, one hind leg bent awkwardly. But his eyes, those alert, stormy eyes, remained bright. Behind him, the cub stood tall, trembling but upright. Blood matted its shoulder and one ear. But it stared at Marlin with defiance, not fear. Then something astonishing happened. The younger cub, smaller, quiet, still hiding behind the tree, stepped forward. It had seen everything, and now it crept slowly to its sibling's side and nuzzled its face against the other's bloodied cheek. The older cub didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head slightly. Protective. The moment hung. 3 creatures battered by violence, standing in the ruin of a fight none of them had chosen, but all of them had survived. Marlin swallowed hard. She had seen predators before, watched coyotes pick off fawns, seen hawks claw into rabbits. But this was different. There was something deliberate in the way the cubs had worked with Roan. Something that crossed the line between instinct and understanding. These weren't just wild animals fighting for life. They were forming an alliance. She approached slowly. "Easy," she murmured, setting the rifle down and raising her hands. Rowan didn't bark. He sat, panting heavily. The older cub turned to face her. It didn't hiss, didn't retreat. It stood its ground, eyes locked on hers, like it was waiting for her next move. Marlin crouched and held out one hand, palm open. The cub tilted its head. Then, hesitantly, cautiously, it took one step forward. It wasn't protocol. Marlin Kessler had never brought wild predators into the outpost, not in a decade of fieldwork. Injured coyotes were tagged and reported. Rattlesnakes were relocated. Bobcats were documented, monitored from a distance, then left to the wild. But this wasn't just protocol anymore. This was something else. The 2 cubs, one limping, the other still alert but slow to react, followed Roan back through the winding trail, like shadows stitched to his feet. They didn't flinch at Marlin's presence, though Tessan, the smaller cub, kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting the python to reappear from behind every gully. Marlin didn't try to leash them. There was no need. The bond had already been made between them and Rowan. The shepherd walked slightly ahead, ears twitching at every crack of brush, his gait uneven but determined. Every so often he'd glance back, nose dipping to check the cubs without making a sound. By the time they reached the outpost, a modest adobe-roofed ranger station flanked by brush and solar panels, the sun had begun to fall behind the ridge. Gold light poured over the cliff faces, casting long shadows through the cedar posts and fencing. Marlin opened the side shed, once used for emergency animal care, and laid down old canvas blankets layered with cooling gel packs. It wasn't much, but it was clean, safe, and quiet. Rowan stepped in and laid down with a deep, slow groan. Solin followed without hesitation, curling at Rowan's side, his body rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. Tessan paused at the door, scanning the shadows outside. Then, after a long moment, she padded in and pressed herself into the corner, her back to the wall, where she could still watch the night. Marlin knelt. Solin's wound wasn't fresh anymore, but it was ragged, a clean puncture near the shoulder from the python's tail whip. Not deep enough to disable, but enough to fester. With a slow hand, she reached toward him, whispering low. Rowan gave a small whine and looked up at her. Permission granted. She cleaned the wound gently. Solin didn't growl. He winced but didn't retreat. The second wound, the deeper one, was harder to name. Marlin noticed it when the moon had risen, when the shed was silent except for the slow, rhythmic breaths of sleep. Solin twitched in his sleep, muscles contracting in waves. His legs kicked once, violently as if running, and then the sound, not a growl, but a low whimper, a soft, broken cry. Tessan, still awake in the corner, watched him without blinking. Marlin leaned against the doorframe and felt the weight of the canyon settle into her bones. They had lost something. She didn't know what. A parent, most likely. Maybe a den. Maybe both. But whatever it was, the loss had carved itself into the fabric of these cubs. And the python, blind in one eye, still out there somewhere, wasn't done yet. The next morning, Marlin began her reports. Illegal exotic? Potential ecological threat? She checked the right boxes, logged GPS coordinates, and uploaded the incident notes into the regional wildlife database. But there was no reception out here, not without a satellite ping, so the report would sit idle until she drove 20 miles out toward Ridgepoint Station. She didn't want to leave. Rowan still limped. Solin had barely moved. Tessan refused to eat until the sun was high, and even then only after Rowan nudged her bowl toward her with his nose. That night, Marlin sat on the porch of the station, staring out into the dark. The desert made a different kind of silence at night. No rustling leaves, no water trickling, just still air and the occasional moan of wind across canyon mouths. Her radio crackled once, then went quiet again. She felt a warmth at her feet. Rowan had come to sit beside her, and behind him, silently, came both cubs. Solin sat close to Rowan's right side. Tessan hovered near the doorframe. She wasn't ready to step into the open, not yet. But she was there, choosing to be close. Marlin stared at the three of them, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't just wildlife behavior. This was survival bond. Something had passed between Rowan and those cubs in that gully. Something unspoken. Something that didn't belong in textbooks or field manuals. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't trust, even. Not yet. It was recognition. They had seen each other. They had fought together. They remembered. By the fourth day, the bobcats were moving better. Solon was cautious but no longer limping. He stalked the outer fence line of the ranger yard, testing the wind, climbing halfway up a firewood pile before leaping off again. Tesson followed in short bursts, mimicking his steps. Malin watched from the kitchen window, coffee in hand. She had removed the GPS tags from the tranquilizer darts and cleaned the wound dressings again. No signs of infection, no fever, and no aggression. Still, she felt the unease settle in again. She had sent the initial report, but no response had come through. No acknowledgement from State Wildlife Control. No feedback from the tracking lab in Boulder. Either the signals hadn't reached them, or someone wasn't listening. That evening, Rowan paced near the gate. It was the first time since the fight that he'd shown agitation. Not restlessness, not pain, but tension. Malin stepped outside. "What is it?" Rowan growled low. Tesson was alert too, tail stiff. She turned her head toward the far ridge. Solon stood beside the shed, staring across the dry brush as if he could see through the dark. The air shifted. A single vulture passed overhead. And on the horizon, Malin saw it. A groove in the sand, freshly carved, long, serpentine. The python had returned. The young bobcat's leap was wild, more instinct than strategy. Its small body twisted mid-air, paws extended, claws flashing silver in the half-light. For one heartbeat, it soared. Then it landed squarely on the python's upper coil, just behind its head. The snake responded instantly. It reared, muscles rippling as its thick body convulsed in a sudden arc. Dust exploded from the earth. The cub held fast, jaws snapping forward and sinking into the python's neck, right above the jaw hinge. A scream rose from the snake. Not a voice, but a terrible vibrating rasp that shivered through Marlin's bones. Rowan, dazed but recovering, pushed himself to his feet, growling low. His shoulder bled, but he was still in the fight. The python whipped its tail again, aiming to dislodge the bobcat. But the cub wouldn't let go. Its claws dug deep. Its fangs remained locked in. Marlin knew what this was now. Not survival. This was vengeance. This cub had likely seen something she hadn't. Perhaps this snake had already taken their mother. Perhaps the cub remembered. And now it was fighting not to escape, but to end it. Still, he was so small. The python coiled tighter, lifting its massive body off the ground. The bobcat was thrown, landing hard against the dry mud bank. It skidded, yowling, but didn't cry out. Rowan leapt in again. He attacked from the side, jaws clamping down on the python's midsection. This time, he bit hard enough that blood welled, thick and dark, and the snake screeched, spinning violently in the dust. Its tail smashed into Rowan's back, sending him tumbling. "Rowan!" Malin shouted, stepping forward with the tranq rifle. She had no clear shot. Too much movement. The cub was back on its feet. Limber, fast. It lunged again, not for the neck this time, but for the eyes. It struck like lightning. The bobcat's front claws slashed across the python's face, catching its right eye. The serpent reared back with a hideous lurch, body arching, its momentum lifting part of it clean off the ground. Dust and gravel spun into the air. The python was blind on one side now. It turned, panicked. But the fight was unraveling. Rowan came in from behind, teeth finding flesh again. The bobcat dove once more, this time aiming for the wounded eye. The snake writhed, twisting violently, knocking against rock and bark. The sheer chaos of it churned the ravine into a storm of sound and motion. Then it broke. The python uncoiled, half collapsing under its own pain. Its body undulated wildly, smacking into trees, cutting a bloody trail through the dust. Then, with a final heave, it slithered off, crashing through the brush. It didn't die, but it was defeated. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was tense, rattling, fragile. Malan's knees gave slightly. She lowered the tranq rifle, chest heaving. The smell of blood, bobcat, dog, and snake hung thick in the air. Rowan limped back toward her, fur coated in grit, panting. His flanks were scratched, one hind leg bent awkwardly. But his eyes, those alert, stormy eyes, remained bright. Behind him, the cub stood tall, trembling but upright. Blood matted its shoulder and one ear. But it stared at Malan with defiance, not fear. Then something astonishing happened. The younger cub, smaller, quiet, still hiding behind the tree, stepped forward. It had seen everything, and now it crept slowly to its sibling's side and nuzzled its face against the other's bloodied cheek. The older cub didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, protective. The moment hung, 3 creatures battered by violence, standing in the ruin of a fight none of them had chosen, but all of them had survived. Malan swallowed hard. She had seen predators before, watched coyotes pick off fawns, seen hawks claw into rabbits. But this was different. There was something deliberate in the way the cubs had worked with Roan. Something that crossed the line between instinct and understanding. These weren't just wild animals fighting for life. They were forming an alliance. She approached slowly. "Easy," she murmured, setting the rifle down and raising her hands. Rowan didn't bark. He sat, panting heavily. The older cub turned to face her. It didn't hiss, didn't retreat. It stood its ground, eyes locked on hers, like it was waiting for her next move. Malan crouched and held out one hand, palm open. The cub tilted its head. Then, hesitantly, cautiously, it took one step forward. The tracks weren't there the night before. But by morning, they cut like a scar across the hard pan, a thick, dragging line, flanked by faint, rhythmic impressions that only one creature could leave behind. Malan stared at them from the ridge above Waker's Hollow, heart thudding against her ribs. The python was moving again. Worse, it was heading toward one of the last permanent springs tucked deep in the folds of the canyon, Cold Eye Pool, a sacred watering spot used by everything from mule deer to migrating cranes. If the snake settled there, it wouldn't just kill. It would dominate. She lowered her binoculars. The wind shifted behind her. Rowan stood waiting, silent. His coat rippled in the breeze, eyes locked not on her, but on the dust trail the python had left in its wake. Solon and Tessan crouched in the scrub nearby, invisible to most eyes. But not to Malan. She'd learned to read them now. Solin's tail flicked with anticipation. Tessan's muscles coiled tight like springs. They knew. They had felt it. The python had returned for them. Malin closed her satchel with a heavy breath. "We end this today." She didn't say it for drama. There was no one around to hear it. No camera, no crew, no reports due. Just her, a shepherd whose ribs still bore bruises, and 2 wild cubs with a score to settle. Waker's Hollow was not a welcoming place. Its red cliffs pinched into narrow funnels, thick with thorn brush and collapsed shale. It had once held a mining camp that had long since eroded into ruin. Ghost stories lingered, about poisoned springs, miners swallowed by sandstorms. But Marlan had always thought of it as just another forgotten part of the wild. Now, it felt cursed. She kept her tranq rifle slung across her back, loaded and primed. They moved fast, tracing the edge of the gully where the tracks vanished into a craggy bowl half filled with rock and shade. The moment they crested the rise above Cold Eye Pool, she saw it. The python, coiled like a molten chain, glistening in the filtered sun. Its massive body lay half in shadow, half on warm rock. One eye was clouded, scarred from the battle. The other, still golden, cold, blinked once as it sensed them. It hadn't come to hide. It had come to finish what it started. Rowan growled low. Solin stepped forward, slow and sure. Not charging, not impulsive, deliberate. Tessan followed a few paces behind, her tail low, ears forward. Marlan crouched behind a cluster of basalt, heart hammering. The rifle in her hands felt too small. The snake stirred. Its body undulated in a ripple. Muscle, power, hunger. The smell of dry musk filled the air. Dust blew. Solin and Tessan flanked out. Instinctive hunters now, not cubs. And then, everything erupted. The python struck first. A blur of motion, jaws wide, teeth curved like broken glass. It aimed not at the cubs this time, but at Rowan. Rowan ducked under the lunge. He feinted left, drawing the serpent's body out across the rock. Solin launched from the right, claws extended, catching the snake mid-neck. His body twisted in mid-air, and he latched on. Tessan darted forward, biting into the tail coil with surprising ferocity. The python screamed, a rasping vibration that echoed off the stone walls. It coiled violently, flinging Tessan aside. She landed hard against the shale and rolled. Solin hung on. Rowan surged forward, going low, jaws clamping on the snake's underbelly, where its skin was softest. The python bucked. Solin was thrown, skidding across stone. Blood sprayed from a shallow cut across his cheek, but he didn't retreat. Marlan moved. She found position on the ridge above, rifle braced. But the python's body blocked its heart. Too many coils. Too much movement. Tessan rose again, this time snarling, and went for the tail. She bit down, anchoring. Solin pounced from the boulder's edge, sinking claws just behind the snake's good eye. Rowan charged the belly again, 3 coordinated attacks. The python uncoiled in rage. It lunged upward, straight toward Marlan. It didn't see her. It simply struck toward motion. A giant, lethal whip of muscle and fangs. Marlan fired. The dart flew, a perfect shot, into the soft flesh behind the jaw. The python reared back, roared. Its body slammed the rock, slithered violently, whipped once, then collapsed. The sound of its fall echoed like a landslide. It wasn't dead, but it was finished. The tranquilizer would hold for hours, long enough for relocation crews to arrive. Long enough to end this. Malin dropped her rifle and slid down the slope, heart still thudding. Rowan stood, panting hard, foam around his lips. His chest rose and fell like bellows. Solin limped toward Tessan, nuzzling her side. She pressed her head to his chest, then turned her gaze to Rowan. They stood in a triangle, battered and bloodied, but whole. Malin fell to her knees beside them. The python's body still twitched with the last currents of reflex. But it was over. No one spoke. Not even the wind. They had done it. Together. That night, back at the station, under a silver moon, Marlon lit the signal flare for retrieval crews. She'd tagged the python with a location beacon and left it deep in Waker's Hollow. The data would go to state biologists, a warning to all others about invasive predators riding illegal trade routes into ecosystems that couldn't handle them. But none of that would explain what really mattered. What had happened here wasn't science. It was something older. Rowan lay curled near the fireplace, bandaged. Tessan rested beside his flank. Solin sat at the far window, eyes watching the moonlit horizon as if guarding something sacred. Malin stepped outside and stared at the dark ridges. The wild wasn't cruel. It was just unflinching. And tonight, something rare had happened within it. A dog, 2 bobcats, and a woman had faced death, and rewritten the rules of who saves whom. The morning after the fight, the canyons were quiet. Not empty. Life pulsed through the brush and rock, but quiet in that rare way the land sometimes offered after a storm. Not a wind stirred. No birds called. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. It was as though the world, too, needed a moment to take in what had happened. Malin stood at the edge of her station porch, arms crossed loosely over her chest, coffee untouched in her hand. Ahead, the 2 bobcat cubs, no longer quite cubs, sat beneath the crooked shade of an old juniper tree. Tessan cleaned a cut above her paw with slow, careful licks. Solin, eyes half-lidded, watched Rowan. And Rowan, he was sleeping in the dust. A soft snore rose from his broad chest, but his tail twitched now and then. Even in sleep, he was alert. Malin smiled faintly. They had survived, all of them. And yet survival wasn't the only thing that had happened. It would have been easy to file it all away under extraordinary behavior under stress, some scientific category that made the mystery easier to ignore. But she couldn't do that, because something deeper had shifted. Between Rowan and the cubs, between the cubs and her, even between herself and this land she'd thought she already knew. They had crossed a line together, and none of them would go back the same. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the outpost changed. Marlon converted the old garage into a proper transition den, high fencing, overhead netting, shaded rock piles. It wasn't a cage, just a space to recover, to decide what came next. Solin began testing the perimeter by day, disappearing into the scrub and returning by night. He brought back lizards. Once, a jackrabbit tail. He was teaching Tessan, nudging her forward when she hesitated, circling back when she fell behind. Rowan didn't follow, but he always watched. Sometimes, Malin would find the dog standing in the doorway just before sunset, his head tilted toward the canyon. Listening. Waiting. She wondered if he was hoping to hear the python again. Or maybe something else. 2 weeks later, a state vehicle finally arrived. A biologist named Davin Tressel stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the dry sun. "We got your files late," he said. "Storm damage at the tower, some reports backed up. You weren't wrong. Python's real. Burmese. Probably dumped by a failed breeder. It's a miracle you got out with the dog intact." Marlon nodded. She said nothing about Solon or Tessan yet. He stepped toward the den. "You said something about bobcats?" She hesitated. "Yeah," she finally said. 2 orphans. Rehabilitating. Planning soft release." Tressel raised an eyebrow. "Together with the dog? They work well in a group." He chuckled. "Right. Pack of 3. Hell of a story." She didn't correct him. Because it wasn't a story. It was a pact. They released Tessan first. She was ready sooner. Cautious but agile, steady on her feet, her fear replaced by alert intelligence. She walked out into the wild one morning just after dawn, tail high, paws silent. Solon followed 3 days later. He paused at the gate, turned to Rowan, and blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Then he ran. Not far. Malin spotted him days later on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the stars. Watching. Rowan stood beside her then, ears forward, tail motionless. Neither of them spoke. By autumn, the canyons changed color. The ridge was dusted in amber. Shadows stretched longer. Cold Eye Pool had shrunk to half its size, fed only by underground trickles now. The python, now tagged and tracked by the state, was being monitored at a desert facility 3 counties south. It wouldn't return. But every so often, Marlon would step out onto her porch and find fresh tracks at the edge of the yard. Bobcat. Small. Then, larger ones beside them. Sometimes there were scratches in the bark of the juniper. Sometimes feathers, left like gifts. And once a dead rattlesnake curled on the step. A warning or a promise? That winter, Rowan grew slower. His gait stiffened. His eyes grew cloudy at the edges. But the fire never left him, and he always perked up when, just after sunset, the wind shifted down from the ridge and carried with it the faintest scent of 2 wild hearts that had once fought beside him. Malin knew what it meant. They still watched over him, just as he once had watched over them. One night, long after the moon had climbed, Marlin sat by the fire with her hand on Rowan's back. He breathed steady. Outside, the world was quiet. Then, from the tree line, a sound. Soft. 2 sets of paws in the dust. She rose slowly and opened the door. There they were. Solon stood tall now, broad-chested, a scar across his cheek. Tessan beside him, quicker, leaner, eyes bright. They didn't step closer. They didn't need to. They had come to look, to see, to remember. Rowan opened his eyes, and in that shared moment of silence, the pact held. It always would. Not between species, not between pets and people, but between those who survive together and who never forget the wild debt they owe one another.